In the summer of his illness, a Tang emperor dreamed of a thief. The thief was small and quick, a little ghost in red, darting through the palace. And in the dream, it had already stolen two things: a perfumed purse belonging to his favorite consort, and the emperor's own jade flute. Then something larger came. A giant in a torn blue robe and the black cap of a government official seized the little ghost, pressed a thumb into its eye, tore the eye out, and ate it. The emperor, watching from his sickbed, was too frightened to move. So the giant spoke for him. He gave his name. He explained calmly what he was and why he was there. And when the emperor woke, soaked in sweat, the fever that had nearly killed him was simply gone. This is the story of that giant. But it is not, in the way you might expect, the story of a man. Because the figure the emperor saw that night would be painted the very next day. And that painting would outlive the emperor, outlive his dynasty, and go on hanging over the doors of Chinese homes for the next 1,200 years, redrawn in every century, guarding against exactly the kind of thief the emperor had dreamed. His name is Zhong Kui, and the strange thing, the thing scholars still argue about, is whether he was ever a man at all, or whether an object, a simple wooden thing, slowly grew a face, a name, and a death. This is not a biography. It is the life of a painting, and of the fear that kept it on the wall. To understand the painting, you have to start with the dream it claims to copy. And the first thing to say about that dream is that we meet it late. The story is set in the reign of Emperor Xuanzong, who ruled Tang China through the first half of the 8th century, the height of the dynasty, a court of poets and music and enormous wealth. But the dream itself does not reach us from the Tang. It comes to us in full through writers of the Song dynasty, looking back across 300 years. So we should hold it the way they handed it down, not as a court diary of something that happened, but as a story the culture told to explain why a certain painting existed. In that story, the emperor is gravely ill. The texts call it a malarial fever, the kind that comes in waves, with chills and shaking, and a heat that melts the wall between waking and sleep. For a man who controlled an empire, it was a reminder that there were enemies a throne could not command. On one of those nights, he dreams. A small ghost appears in the hall. The later sources even give it a name, Shuhao, which means something close to emptiness and waste, the spirit of petty loss, of things that go missing for no reason, of small fortune draining away. In the dream, it is a thief. It has stolen an embroidered perfume bag belonging to his beloved consort, Yang Guifei, and it has stolen the emperor's own jade flute. And now it is dancing around the hall with them, mocking, weightless, impossible to catch. Think about how small that crime is, and how helpless it makes him. He is the most powerful man on earth, and he cannot stop a minor ghost from robbing his own bedroom. That is what petty evil does. It doesn't threaten your life, it just wears away at it, one missing thing at a time, and dares you to do something about it. And in a court that read meaning into every omen, a ghost robbing the emperor in his own sleep was not a trivial thing at all. It was a sign that something had gone wrong at the very center of the world. And then the second figure enters. He is enormous. He wears a tattered blue robe and the black gauze cap of an official, and one of his feet, the old descriptions say, is bare. He does not chase the little ghost so much as simply take it, catches it in one fist, gouges out its eye, and eats it. The theft is over. The thing that was draining the emperor has itself been devoured. And only now, with the danger gone, does the giant turn to the trembling emperor to explain himself, who he is, why a dead man is standing in the emperor's dream, killing ghosts on his behalf. Xuanzong wakes drenched in sweat, and the fever, the illness that had brought him to the edge, has broken. A dream had cured him, but a dream cannot hang on a door. For that, the emperor would need a painter, and before the painter, he needed to understand who had just saved his life. In the dream, the giant introduced himself, and his answer is the saddest part of the whole legend. He said he was Zhong Kui of Mount Zhongnan, a real range south of the Tang capital, a place of hermits, monks, and failed scholars. He had come, he said, to sit the imperial examinations. To understand why that detail carries so much weight, you have to know what the examinations were. In Tang, China, the great written and martial tests were the one ladder a man of no birth could climb, pass, and a commoner could enter the governing class, win rank and robes and a future. Fail, and you went home with nothing but the shame of it. People gave years, sometimes their whole youth, to that single chance. And here the sources begin to disagree, in a way worth naming honestly. Some versions say Zhong Kui sat the civil examination, the great written test. Others say it was the military one. The legend is not even consistent about which emperor's reign it happened in, which is part of why scholars would later grow suspicious of the whole thing. But every version agrees on what happened. He failed. Or in the tellings that sting most, he passed brilliantly, ranked at the very top, and was then struck from the list anyway. Denied his rank not for any fault in his answers, but because of his face, because he was ugly. Because the men who decided such things looked at him, and decided a face like that could not stand in the dignity of the Tang court. Imagine giving everything to earn a place, earning it, and being told the place was never really open to a face like yours. The shame was unbearable. In the dream, he tells the emperor that he threw his own head against the stone steps of the palace and died there, on the very threshold of the career that had just been taken from him. That should be the end of him. A failed candidate, a suicide on the palace steps, the kind of person history does not bother to keep. But the story gives him one more turn. The reigning emperor, in most tellings the founder of the dynasty, generations before Xuanzang, heard of the death and was moved by it. He ordered the dead man dressed in a green robe, the robe of exactly the low-ranking official he had been denied the right to become, and buried with full honor. It was a small thing, and it came too late. A scrap of recognition given to a man already dead. But in the logic of the legend, it was everything. Because Zhong Kui, the giant, tells the emperor, swore an oath in gratitude for that green robe. He would spend his death doing what he was never allowed to do in life. He would serve the empire. He would hunt down every shuhao, every petty thieving ghost, every small evil that preys on the living, until there were none left in all of Tang. The man the court had rejected for his ugly face had become the one thing that ugliness was suddenly good for. And that is the figure the emperor woke up determined to keep. Here the legend does something unusual. It names a painter, and the painter, at least, is real. Emperor Xuanzang, the tale says, woke from his dream, recovered from his fever, and summoned the greatest artist of the age. His name was Wu Daozi. And unlike Zhong Kui, Wu Daozi is not in doubt as a person. He was a real master of the High Tang, so admired that later ages called him the Sage of Painting. The stories about him border on the supernatural. He could draw a perfect circle freehand. The robes of his painted figures seemed to billow in a wind only they could feel. And when he painted hell on a temple wall, the famous hell transformation, the image of punishment was so vivid that butchers and fishmongers in the city are said to have changed their trades rather than risk what they had seen. This was the hand the emperor chose. He described his dream, the giant, the blue robe, the black cap, the bare foot, the ghost crushed in one fist, and asked Wu Daozi to set it down exactly as it had appeared. And the painter, the story says, worked as though he had stood in the dream himself. He produced the figure in a single inspired effort, and when the emperor looked at it, he said the painter must have shared his sleep, because the man on the silk was the man from the night before, down to the last hair of the beard. Now think about what that moment actually is. Up to this point, Zhong Kui existed only inside one sleeping man's skull. The painting is the instant he steps out of it. From here, he is no longer something the emperor merely remembered. He is something other people could see, copy, and hang. And this is the heart of why this is the life of a painting and not the life of a man. In the ordinary order of things, a person lives, and afterward we make images of them. With Zhong Kui, the order runs backward. There is no body, no grave anyone can visit, no surviving record of his examination. There is only the image, and everything we call Zhong Kui grows outward from it. And even that image we take partly on faith. The claim that Wu Daozi painted him reaches us from the same Song dynasty source as the dream, 3 centuries late, and no original survives. What we can say is that from the High Tang onward, the elements his tradition is said to have fixed became a template every later painter would copy and vary. The fierce bearded giant, the official's cap and robe, the glaring eyes, the sword at the ready, the demon crushed underfoot. The emperor began bestowing such portraits on his officials at the end of each year, a gift and a protection in one. And the habit held. For the next 1,000 years, court painters and village printmakers alike kept retracing that same template. The celebrated Zhong Kui specialists of the Song and Qing dynasties were not inventing a face, only copying one that already existed. The god had become a picture you could own. And a picture you can own is a picture you can hang on your door, which is exactly where the trouble starts. Because if the painting came first, what if there had never been a man behind it at all? For most of its life, the legend of Zhong Kui was simply believed. But when later scholars, careful men of the kind who check old words against older ones, began to look at his name, they found something that quietly unsettled the whole story. The name Zhong Kui, written one way, is just a name, but it sounds almost exactly like an older word, Zhong Kui, that has nothing to do with any person. That older word names a thing, a mallet, a club or hammer of a particular hard wood, recorded in ancient ritual texts, used in old China to drive out evil. The kind of object you might swing in an exorcism or stand by a door to beat back unseen harm. And there is evidence that this ritual mallet, and words very close to its name, were tied to driving off demons centuries before any emperor is supposed to have dreamed of a scholar on Mount Zhongnan. So a number of scholars came to suspect that the arrow points the other way, that in the beginning there was no man, only an object. A demon-quelling mallet with a name that happened to sound like a person's name. And that over generations, people who used the word stopped hearing a piece of wood and started hearing a person. The human mind is very bad at leaving a name without a face, so it built one. It gave the name an ugly face, then an examination, then a failure, then a suicide, then a grateful oath, a whole biography, grown like a pearl around the grit of a misheard word. We should be careful here and say plainly what this is. It is a theory, not a verdict. It rests on the patient work of later evidential scholars, the kind of men who could spend a career chasing a single character back through the ancient ritual classics. And the sources they work from are old and thin, the trail faint, and not every scholar agrees. The legend, for its part, cannot even keep its own date straight, which is the sort of crack a theory like this slips through. But it is a leading scholarly explanation for where Zhong Kui came from, and it changes how you see every painting that follows. Because if it is right, then Zhong Kui is something stranger than a god and stranger than a man. He is what happens when a culture needs a protector so badly that it grows one out of a tool, when a thing meant to be held in the hand becomes a person meant to be feared at the door. And whichever way you lean, grieving scholar or personified mallet, the legend and the theory agree on one plain fact. By the late Tang, the figure was no longer on Mount Zhongnan, or in a dream, or in a single man's grief. He was on the door, facing outward, and he was about to stay there for 1,000 years. Once, Zhong Kui was a painting. The painting did what useful images do. It spread. He was not the first guardian on a Chinese door. That tradition was already old. There were earlier door gods, paired warriors whose images were pasted on gates to turn back evil, figures from deep antiquity whose whole purpose was to stand watch at the threshold. Zhong Kui joined that lineage and in time became its most famous member, a guardian who did not even need a partner, a single fierce face strong enough to hold a doorway alone. At first, he belonged to the new year. Through the Song dynasty and after, hanging a Zhong Kui at the turning of the year became ordinary household practice, a fierce protector pasted up to sweep out the bad luck of the old year and stand over the new one. Then, over the centuries, he shifted seasons. By the later dynasties, his great festival had become the Dragon Boat Festival at the start of summer. That timing is not random. Early summer was the dangerous season, the 5th month, long marked as a month of poison, when heat brought disease and the so-called 5 venomous creatures came out, snake and scorpion and the rest. It was exactly when a household most wanted something terrible standing at its gate. And so, beside the printed Zhong Kui, families hung sharp-smelling bundles of mugwort and sweet flag, the green herbs of the 5th month, layering plant and painting into a single seasonal defense. And as woodblock printing spread, Zhong Kui came down off the painted silk scrolls of the wealthy, and onto cheap printed sheets that anyone could buy and paste up. In Shanxi, the province that claims him as a native son, and across regions from the Yangtze Valley to Fujian and out to Taiwan, the same fierce face went up on countless thresholds. Now sit with the strangeness of that habit, because it is the real subject of this chapter. To protect their homes, people did not choose something beautiful or gentle or kind. They chose the ugliest, most frightening figure they could paint. Bulging eyes, a wild black beard, a snarl, a raised sword, and they put him where the family walked in and out every single day. The logic is old, and it is deeply human. Evil, the thinking goes, is driven off by something more fearsome than itself. A petty thieving ghost will not cross a threshold guarded by a giant who eats ghosts. So you do not hide your fear, you weaponize it. You hang your worst nightmare on the front of the house and turn it to face the world, so that everything out there has to look at it first. For 1200 years, that is what Zhong Kui has been. Not mainly a story that people read, but a face that people lived behind, hung at the one place where the safe inside met the dangerous outside. A face that frightening could not stay only frightening. People lived with Zhong Kui every day, year after year, and over time, the way you do with anyone you live beside, they softened him. They gave him a private life. The most beloved of these stories is called Zhong Kui Marries Off His Sister. In his living days, the tale goes, there was one true kindness in his hard life. A poor friend who treated him as an equal when the world would not, and who helped see to his burial after he died. From beyond death, Zhong Kui repays it the way a living brother might. He arranges to give his own younger sister to that friend in marriage, and escorts the wedding himself. Painters adored it. They drew the demon-queller not glaring at a ghost, but riding at the head of a wedding procession, his troupe of little demons turned into bumbling porters and musicians, hoisting the bridal sedan, staggering under the wine jars. The terror becomes a guest at a wedding. The same brush that made him a monster made him a brother, doing right by his family the way an honest man would. Other details gathered around him, each turning his fearsomeness into something almost warm. He is often painted with a bat fluttering near his head, because the word for bat sounds in Chinese like the word for good fortune. So the creature of the dark cave becomes a sign of blessing arriving on quiet wings. Sometimes there are 5 bats circling him, the 5 blessings, swirling around the man who tears out ghosts' eyes. And he is, famously, a drinker. Paintings show him flushed and tipsy, sword gone slack in his hand, eyes half closed. Not a monster at all in that moment, but a god you might actually want at your banquet table. The drunken Zhong Kui became a genre of its own, painted again and again across the centuries. the demon-queller off-duty, human, and a little ridiculous. This is what a culture does to a figure it keeps for 1,000 years. It refuses to let him be only one thing. The same Zhong Kui who devours a ghost in an emperor's dream also walks his sister to her wedding, welcomes good fortune on dark wings, and gets cheerfully, harmlessly drunk. Fearsome at the door, tender by the fire. And that doubleness, the monster who is also family, is exactly what kept him alive in the imagination long enough to be summoned, one more time, into a world that Tang could never have pictured. For most of the 20th century, Zhong Kui faded from the door. Printed New Year gods gave way to other decorations. The fierce face that once guarded every threshold slipped into the background. A museum subject. A thing your grandparents might remember pasting up before a festival. The painting did not die. It just hung quieter. And then, in the summer of 2025, the figure was summoned again, from the direction no Tang emperor could ever have dreamed. The year before, a Chinese studio called Game Science had released its first blockbuster, built on Sun Wukong, the Monkey King of Journey to the West. It sold in the tens of millions and became one of the most talked about games on Earth. A landmark moment that put Chinese mythology, rendered with a blockbuster budget and global ambition, on screens in living rooms from Seoul to Sao Paulo, and turned a national folklore into a worldwide one. It was the first time many players outside Asia had met these figures at all, and the appetite it revealed for Chinese myth told at blockbuster scale turned out to be enormous. So when the studio revealed what it was making next, people paid attention. The closing image of the announcement was a giant on the back of an enormous tiger, glaring out of the dark. The title was Black Myth, Zhong Kui. There was no gameplay yet, no release date, barely more than that single shot of the giant on his tiger, glaring out of the dark. And that was enough. Overnight, a name that had drifted toward folklore footnotes was trending around the world, searched by millions of people, many of whom had never seen a New Year talisman in their lives, all asking the oldest question about him. Who is this? And notice what the game is actually doing, because it is the exact thing this whole episode has been circling. It is not discovering Zhong Kui, it is redrawing him. The tiger, the darkness, the official's bearing, the fearsome glare, these are the same elements Wu Daozi's tradition fixed 1,200 years ago, rendered now in light instead of ink, on a screen instead of a door. The studio did not have to invent a look for him. It was already 1,000 years old, waiting in the woodblock prints and the temple scrolls, ready to be lit up again. The medium changed completely. The image barely changed at all. A figure who began perhaps as a wooden mallet, who became a dream, who became a painting, who became a god on 10,000 thresholds, is now becoming pixels, the newest coat of paint on the oldest protective face in China. The door he guards looks different now. It glows, and it is sold in millions of copies. But the impulse is identical. The little ghost in the Emperor's dream stole a purse and a flute. The dark that today's players send Zhong Kui against is built of pixels and code. The threat keeps changing its clothes, and there is something fitting in which figure they chose to bring back. Not a gentle god, not a romantic hero, but the one whose entire purpose was to be more frightening than the dark itself. So 1,200 years on, the impulse has not changed at all. People still choose the most frightening thing they can imagine. They still set it facing outward, between themselves and the dark, and they still call that chosen monster their protection. So, was there ever a man? We honestly do not know. There is no grave, no examination record, no body, only a name that sounds like a mallet, a dream written down some 300 years after it was supposedly dreamed, and a painting copied 10,000 times. If you came for a person, the trail simply runs out. But step back, and you start to suspect the question was always the wrong one. Because something here is unmistakably real, more real, in its way, than most of the kings and generals whose actual bones we can dig up. Not the man, the need. For 1200 years, through one dynasty after another, through the rise and fall of empires that each believed themselves permanent, ordinary people kept reaching for the same image and pinning it to the same place, the threshold, the thin line between the safe inside and the dangerous outside. They did it in the Tang, and they did it in the Song. They did it on painted silk and on cheap printed paper. They are doing it now in a video game searched by millions. The dynasties that hung him are dust. The painting is not. And what it tells us has nothing to do with whether a scholar once died on the palace steps. It tells us something about how human beings handle fear. We do not pretend the dark is empty. We give it a face, the worst face we can manage, and we set it facing outward, and we decide quietly that a monster we have chosen is better than the monsters we have not. Zhong Kui is that decision, made over and over for 1,000 years. Empires learned to fear new things and forgot the old ghosts. The painting simply took in each new darkness and kept its post at the door. A thief in a dream, a failure on the steps, a mallet that grew a name, a god at the door, and now a giant on a tiger, glaring out of a screen, still guarding a threshold that after all this time has somehow still not closed.